Okay, Pasha Shlach. Now, Pasha Shlach talks about the Meraglim, the the spies that were sent out by Moshe Rabbeinu to search out the land of Eretz Yisrael. According to Chazal, although Moshe Rabbeinu received permission from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to send out the spies, it was basically what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, really, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that really you don't have to send out the spies. I already informed them about Eretz Yisrael. But if you want to send out spies, you have permission to send out spies. But there is a risk involved. And of course, the worst of that risk took place as a result of the sending out of the spies. The spies, who initially were Roshei B'nai Yisrael, they were leaders of the Jewish people, the leaders of each of the tribes of the Jewish people. But something happened when they got to Eretz Yisrael, and all of a sudden, they changed over completely. And when they returned, they gave a very detrimental report about Eretz Yisrael. And their attitude was the Jewish people will never be able to capture Eretz Yisrael. And they will be destroyed by the Canaanim. And they led a rebellion against HaKadosh Baruch Hu and against Moshe Rabbeinu. And as a result of that, the Jewish people had to spend 40 years in the desert, traveling till that generation, the adult generation at that time, died out. And the Torah tells us that when Moshe Rabbeinu gave them instructions, Maharetz Hashmeinihi Imraza, that they should check. They should check the land. How is the land? Is it fertile? Is it lean? Are there trees in it or not? And strengthen yourselves and take from the fruits of the land. And then the pasuk concludes, "V'hayamim yemei bikurein oven." Those days were the days of the ripening of the grapes. Now it could be that, and that's the simple pshat. The simple pshat of the pasuk is that those were the months where grapes in Eretz Yisrael ripened. However, there is a very strange medrash, and the medrash says the whole tragedy of the Meraglim, the rebellion that took place because Hayamim Yemei Bikurein Avim, because the days were the days of the ripening of the grapes. Seems very strange. And then the Medrash continues and says something even stranger. And the Medrash says, this is the same thing at the time of Moshe's birth. So, Vatar Haisha Yocheved, Moshe's mother, Moshe's mother gave birth, and she or she conceived, whatever it is. Vatar Haisha, Vatelet Bain, and she gave birth. Vatera also Kitovhu, and she saw that he was Tov. There are all kinds of medrashim. What does Tov meant? Some say Tov meant that he was born without an orla. Some say Tov was that that they saw the whole light, the whole house lit up, but they saw there was something special, something unique. But it's Pineu Shloshirachim, and she hid him for 3 months. Below Yochlod Hatspino, but after 3 months she couldn't hide him anymore. But Tikav Lo Tevas Goma. So she took a wicker basket and smeared it with clay and pitch, and she placed a child in it and placed it among the reeds at the bank of the river. So the Medrash says that because at the time of the Meraglim, it was the time of the ripening of the grapes, and that's the reason for the 3 months below Yochlod Hatspino Vatispineu Shloshirachim, that she hid him for 3 months below Yochlod Hatspino, and she couldn't hide him, Moshe, after Moshe was born. She couldn't hide him more than 3 months. The Medrash says that she actually gave birth at 7 months, and so they weren't beginning the 7th month. So they weren't expecting. They weren't expecting him to be born at that time. So she was able to hide him. But after the 3 months were over, so they begin to wonder why she doesn't have a baby yet. They would check. There's a medrash that the Egyptians would bring another child, and the child would cry in order to get other children to cry, whatever it is. But she could no longer, Yocheved could no longer hide Moshe. And all this is because Bahayamim Yemei Bikurai Anovim. The days were the days of the ripening of the grapes. Now, it's conceivable that this incident also took place during months that are identified and associated agriculturally with the ripening of the grapes. But other than that, and even with that, it doesn't seem to make any sense. What is the message that the Medrash is trying to tell us? We have to understand. Now, it's very interesting. The Gemara tells us in Sota, I think Daf Yud Beis, that originally Amram, he was one of the leader, perhaps, of the Jewish people. In the early years in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, before Moshe Rabbeinu was born. And when Paro made his decree, Kol Haben Hayilot Hayora Tashlichuhu, that every child, every male child that is born has to be killed. So Amram separated himself from his wife Yocheved. After all, if they have a child, and to a certain degree, it seems that he set himself up as an example. It was a suggestion to the other Jews in Egypt also to follow his example. Because what would be the purpose of having one child after the other child and all of them being killed by the Egyptians? And then his daughter, Miriam, said, your Gzeira, your decree is worse than Paro. And the Gemara gives a number of explanations. The most famous explanation is that Paro only made a decree concerning male children. But you are eliminating any Jewish children from being born. Because the other Jews are going to are following your example. And as a result of that, Amram, in a sense, remarried Yocheved. And Miriam, according to the Gemara, who was at that time very young, had a Mara Nevuah, prophecy. She saw prophecy. And the prophecy was that her mother, who was already at an advanced age, was Bas Levi, the daughter of Levi, would have a child. And that child will be the Moshiach Yisrael, will be the redeemer of the Jewish people from Egypt. He will be God's agent to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And then when he was born, and Yocheved, the mother, and the rest of the family saw that when he was born, that the house, as a result of that through some miracle, Moshe, the infant Moshe, lit up the house. So Amram went over to Miriam, and he said, your prophecy is being fulfilled. And they were able to hide him for 3 months. But at the completion of the 3 months, they no longer were able to hide him. And that's when Yocheved had to take the basket. She needed a particular basket, and she had to put tar around it on the outside in order to ensure. And she put Moshe in the basket, and they put the basket with Moshe in it near the shores of the Nile. And at that point, Amram went over to Yocheved, and he touched her head. I don't know the significance of that. He touched her head, and he said to her, what happened to your prophecy? And then Amram, then Yocheved, the Torah tells us that Yocheved that Yocheved that Miriam Ledeya Maya Salam, and his sister stationed herself at a distance to know what would happen with him. And as Rashi points out, to see the completion of her prophecy. And in a sense, the truth of the matter is, this is, well, okay, so we have to understand, what does this have to do with Hayomim Yemei Bikurei Anavim? The days were the days of the ripening of the grapes. Now, when we take a look regarding the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, that was the source of death for all of mankind. Adam Arishon and Chava were told that Chava through Adam Arishon from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he cannot eat, that they cannot eat from the Eitz Hadas. And the day they eat from the Eitz Hadas, the process of dying will begin. And how the snake enticed Chava to eat from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge, and Chava then tricked, I should be using the word used tricked, but enticed Adam Arishon to eat from the Eitz Hadas. And of course, the process of death of mankind began, and Chava and Adam Arishon were taken out of Gan Eden, were taken out of the special garden they had been placed in after their creation. And all kinds of curses were placed on them. Adam Arishon had to work very hard. And at that point, he didn't even have tools. He had to plant with the fingers of his hands. And Chava had to have labor pains when she gave birth. But the question is, what type of tree was the Eitz Hadas? The Gemara in Brachas mentions all kinds of different opinions. And the Gemara gives a very strange conclusion. The Gemara indicates that the opinion that is most likely that it was a tree that produced grain or wheat. It's very strange. There are explanations for it, but that's not our topic today. But the Medrash also lists many opinions what it was. But whereas the Gemara suggests that the opinion that the tree was a wheat tree, whatever that means, the Medrash seems inclined to believe that the main opinion was that it was a vine. Grapes. And I think now regarding the Eitz Hadas, the Rambam at the beginning of Moreh Nevuchim mentions that many of that there was a philosopher that asked him a question. And the Rambam was very impressed with the question. And he said that every thinking individual should really ask that question. And the Rambam's, the question was, when you take a look at the Torah regarding Eitz Hadas and about Adam and Chava not listening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and eating from the Eitz Hadas, eating from the tree of knowledge, it seems, the philosopher thought, that they were rewarded for their sin instead of being punished. Because the Torah tells us that as a result of eating from the Eitz Hadas, They became Yodeya Tov v'Ra. They became knowledgeable in good and bad, in the difference between good and bad. Implication being that before they ate from the Eitz Hadas, they didn't have that insight. And only after violating the commandment of God and eating from the Eitz Hadas, they became Yodea Tov v'Ra, knowing good and evil, knowing the difference between good and evil. And the Rambam answered the philosopher by saying, he said, we have two forms of thinking. You have Yodea Emes v'Sheker, truth and false, and Tov v'Ra, and good and bad. Now, for example, when you say that, this was the example my father would always give when he would discuss it. A triangle has 180 degrees. You're not going to say it's good that a triangle has 180 degrees. You'll say it's true that a triangle has 180 degrees. And if you say it has 165 degrees, it's not bad, it's false. If you say there's a law of gravity, we would say that's true. We wouldn't say it's good. So when it comes to mathematical truths, when it comes to scientific truths, the criteria is not good and bad. Unfortunately, today, people, especially when it comes to medical issues, instead of looking at them from the point of view of true and false, there is a tendency to look at them from the perspective of good and bad. And good and bad becomes a variable. It changes from time to time, from person to person, from situation to situation. However, when it comes to moral truths, so then we say it's good and bad. It's good not to steal. It's bad to steal. So there's a difference between the perspective of good and bad on one hand and true and false on the other hand. From the perspective of good and bad, of true and false, you shouldn't murder. Why? Because you shouldn't murder. From the perspective of bad and good, you shouldn't murder because it's bad to murder. But what very often happens that depending on your relationship with somebody and your involvement with somebody and your situation with somebody, sometimes a person could suggest murder in general is bad, but in this situation, it might be good. It opens a Pandora's box when we apply good and bad to moral truths. And my father, I heard from my father, and I think I saw the same thing in my uncle's name, that before Adam Arishon, before Adam and Eve ate from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge, there was no discrepancy, no wedge, no separation between scientific and mathematical truths and moral truths. Everything was viewed from the perspective of Emes v'Sheker, from the perspective of truth and false. But as a result of man eating from the Eitz Hadas, Adam eating from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge, A wedge was created, a separation was created between mathematical and scientific truths on one hand and moral truths on the other. Mathematical truths and scientific truths, and even that is beginning to change today, it seems to me, was viewed from the perspective of emes v'sheker, from true and false. But when it comes to scientific, when it comes to moral truths, that's viewed from the perspective of good and bad. That's why in a short period of time, forms of behavior that were considered abomination, that were considered the ultimate sin, murder, all of a sudden can become a mitzvah. We know about the laws that are being passed, that were passed in the New York State legislature and in a number of other states. Of assisted suicide. From the perspective of true and false, there can be no justification, no rationalization for assisted suicide. But from this perspective of good and bad, everybody can create their own good. And when you create your own good, you can have others begin to perceive things from the perspective that you created. And their good becomes what is in your good. And murder not only becomes allowed and justified, but actually becomes, unfortunately, lo aleinu, a mitzvah. And this is true about many other forms of behavior that are prohibited. Our attitude to mitzvos has to be not just I'm not allowed to do it, but I can't do it. It's impossible. Emes v'sheker is based on the concept that there's a degree of scientific approach to moral truths as well. And in a sense, we could suggest that was the problem with the Meraglim. God told Moshe Rabbeinu, he told the Jewish people about Eretz Yisrael. And they should have accepted that. But no. They had to see that there was this focus, and even Moshe Rabbeinu said this, Hatovahi, is it a good land? They began to look at Eretz Yisrael from the perspective of good and bad, independent of emes v'sheker, independent of true and false. And when we begin to view things from the perspective of good and bad, we're likely to change our attitude. And that's what happened with the Meraglim. They were Anoshim Tzadikim. But once they started evaluating things from the perspective of good and bad, so they viewed good and bad not objectively, but they viewed good and bad from what they saw was in their interest. Just like today, people, when they suggest others what is good and bad for them, it doesn't originate in the good and bad for the people who they are giving direction to, but it originates in the good and bad to those giving the advice. And sometimes they might even not be aware in the origin of it. So, Vahiyomim, your baby Kuran of him, it's true, it might have happened that they went there at the time that the grapes were ripening, but that was based on the fact that the way that the what happened with the Miraglim was based on the ripening of the grapes. What was the ripening of the grapes? The grapes was the Eitz Hadas. In Medrash style, it was the ripening of the grapes. And in other words, it was the mistake of Adam Harishon. They began not to see things from the perspective of Emes v'Sheker, but from the perspective of Tov v'Ra. And the interesting thing is, when you see things from the perspective of Tov v'Ra, sometimes you look only what's right in front of you, but not in the long-term implications. It looks good, it looks beautiful. The fruit looks delicious. But long-term, you encounter death, not just for yourself, but for all your future generations. Vahiyomim Yemei Bikuran Avim. What caused the whole episode was the attitude, the attitude about what was the attitude of adopting the attitude that Adam Rishon and Chava had by the Eitz Hadas. And I think to a certain degree, when we take a look at Amram attitude, and Amram was a very great person. The Rambam says that a number of mitzvos were revealed in Mitzrayim to Amram. And then the attitude of Yocheved and the attitude of Miriam. We could apply in a more limited way the same logic. Amram first separated himself. And from the point of view of Tov v'Ra, to a large degree, he was right. How can we bring up children into the world? They're going to be killed. If it's a male child, Paro told the nursemaids, kill him. And any male child should be thrown into the Nile. But then Miriam went to her father and applied the criteria of Emes v'Sheker. We have to rebuild the Jewish people. We have to perpetuate the Jewish people. Yes, there are problems. but we have an obligation. And it has to be done. And initially, Amram accepted what his daughter told him. And he began to see. He saw Moshe was tov. And it looked like they were able to hide him for 3 months. And he viewed the nevuah, the prophecy of his daughter, from that perspective, as how it was unfolding. And initially, it looked like something is going to work. There was no immediate problem. But then they encountered problems. And instead of viewing it, and he said to her, "Where is your prophecy?" It's interesting, the Torah tells us about Miriam that she stood at the bank of the Nile from afar. And it's interesting, the Torah tells us about Avraham Avinu, I mentioned it, that when he took Yitzhak to the Akedah, Vayhi Bayom HaShlishi was on the 3rd day. Vayaris Hamakom Meirachok. He saw the place from afar. And he was there with the Shnei Narav, with his 2 servants, Avram. One was Eliezer, and the other was Yishmael. Yishmael, yes, was the son of Avram, but he was the daughter of a shivcha, of a maidservant. And he had a servile perspective. And the Medrash says, what did Avram see? He saw the place from afar. And the Medrash says, when he saw the place from afar, Har Noah, he saw a beautiful mountain, Va'anan kasher aleha, and a heavenly cloud attached to it. He turned to Yitzchak and he said to Yitzchak, Ma taroah, what do you see? And Yitzchak said, I see a heavenly cloud, I see Har Noah, a beautiful mountain, Va'anan kasher aleha, and a heavenly cloud attached to it. Then he turned to his 2 slaves, Yishmael, who had a servile perspective, the son of Hagar, and he turned also to Eliezer, who was a very great person. But he said to them, what do you see? And he said, we don't see anything. He said, stay here with the donkey. He doesn't see anything. You don't see anything. I discussed this a couple of weeks ago. And me and the lad, me and Yitzchak, will go a little further. And we'll serve God. And we will return to you. So what separated them? Avram and Yitzchak were able to see Hamakom. They were able to see Hamakom is the place. It's the Beis HaMikdash. And Hamakom also is one of the names of God. They were able to see spirituality, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the presence of the Almighty from afar. Eliezer was a very great man. Miracles were performed for him. But Eliezer could see the Shekhinah when it was right in front of him. But to see it from afar, he couldn't see it from afar. And that was Miriam. Miriam stood at the banks of the Nile, Merachok, from afar. As Rashi says, she wanted to see the end of her nevuah. It wasn't what's right in front of me at that time. Amram, it's true, Amram was in Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi wasn't in bondage. But the attitudes of an enslaved people apply to almost everybody. And when he had 3 months to hide Moshe, he said, your nevuah is being niskayim. Somehow, but when after the 3 months they encountered a hardship and they couldn't explain how it would be fulfilled, he said to her, where is your nevuah? Where is your prophecy? To a certain degree, because of the bondage in Egypt. Maybe there wasn't physical bondage for Shevet Levi, but psychological bondage there was. So he was troubled. He couldn't see the future where the present indicated otherwise. But Miriam, she saw the future. And she stood at the banks, Merachok, from afar, as Rashi said, to see the end of her nevuah. Yes, I don't understand how it's working right now, but I know at the end, the nevuah will be true, that the message I received will be true, will be fulfilled. And the pasuk says, V'teisei v'achoso meirachok l'deya mayaselo. L'deya, what does l'deya mean? To know. To know. Well, she knew. L'deya mayaselo. I mention all the time, the Rambam at the beginning of Yad HaChazaka says, Yisod haYisodos v'amud haChochmos leida sheyesham matzu rishon. The mitzvah of belief in God is not a mitzvah of belief, and it's just a mitzvah of belief, but it's experience, to experience God. When you see the sun going up, it's not just the sun going up. You see God putting the sun up. It's one thing to believe in God, it's more than that to experience God. L'deya, ma ye'asalo, what will happen to him? She wanted to experience the fulfillment of the nevuah. And we could say it's even more than that. I mentioned in the past that we have the dream of Yosef. Yosef had these dreams. We're in the fields. And we're making bundles of wheat. And my bundle stands up, and your bundles all bend down to my bundles. And then there is the 11 stars, the sun and the moon, that bend down to me. And Yosef goes and he, to a certain degree, tortures his brothers by telling them over the dream. Yaakov's, even though he chastised Yosef, but he understood that there was something to it, Torah tells us. But the question is asked, why did Yosef go out of his way to tell his brothers? And more than that, once Yosef goes to Egypt, okay, when he's a slave, when he's a prisoner, he's not able to do anything. But when he's the Mishnah Lamelech, he becomes Paro's number 2 man. He runs Egypt. He certainly had the ability to let Yaakov know that he was in Egypt, that he was alive, that he was the second in command to Paro in Egypt. But he makes no attempt until his brothers come down to Egypt, and even then, he tests them and all kinds of things. Why was this necessary? But Yosef knew. We have a general rule that when it comes to Nevuah, it comes to prophecy, but this probably a person is not allowed. That was Yonah's problem. A person is not allowed to withhold the prophecy that he's given. When he's given prophecy, it's given to give over. And Yosef saw his words, his dreams. If it wasn't prophecy itself, it was close to prophecy. It was a message from heaven. And he felt he had an obligation as the messenger to give the message over to his brothers. But it's more than that. Not only did he feel he had an obligation to give the message over, but he had an obligation to bring the message, to bring the dream, to bring the prophecy into fruition. He had to wait. He had to have patience. Moshe Rabbeinu also complained to God, initially. But sometimes a Navi, to see the fulfillment of their nevuah, of their prophecy, they have to have patience. And very often, the patience is necessary because they have to use the time. What seems to them as a delay or whatever, to use it to help bring the dream into fruition. And Miriam understood that it wasn't just a message that he received from heaven, but it was to a certain degree an obligation to see the end of the dream, not just to see it take place, but to help it take place. That's why she had to stand there. That's why it was not enough to believe that it would happen. And to a certain degree, I think, we could suggest that there were 3 different approaches here. There was Amram's approach. Amram's approach was that, okay, he heard his daughter's arguments, everything, it made a lot of sense, sounded emes. But then, as events started taking place that seemed to counter-indicate what the dream was, he says to his daughter, what's with your prophecy? And then you had Yocheved. Yocheved believed in the prophecy. And she took a basket and did all kinds of things with the basket to make sure that Moshe will be okay in the basket. What did she think? That it'll be for how long will it that it would succeed. But she obviously believed in the prophecy. But she couldn't do anything that would negate the prophecy. Not to do anything would be a negation of the prophecy, because the Egyptians would have killed Moshe. So she fixed up this basket. But she didn't stay on the side. That was not her task. The task of seeing the completion of the dream was the one who got that prophecy, and that was Miriam. Miriam got the prophecy. She saw it was her obligation not only to tell them about it, to tell the parents about it, but to see that the prophecy was fulfilled completely. It was meirachok. It wasn't just what was there in front of her. She had to see the completion of the prophecy. And more than seeing it, she had to bring it about. And that's why she was motivated. Amram wavered between emes v'sheker and tov v'ra. Yocheved, it was emes v'sheker. But she did what she felt was her obligation. And what was her obligation? But Miriam, because she was the one who got the prophecy, she had the obligation of seeing that it come to fruition. She understood that she was part of the fulfillment of that prophecy, of the completion of that prophecy. So because of this, she stood meirachok from afar to see, to play a role in the completion of the prophecy. And today that we are overcome with the events that are taking place in Eretz Yisrael, we're not in the position of Miriam. We're not there. We can't experience what the Jews in Eretz Yisrael are experiencing. We certainly can't experience what those who are fighting Milchemes Hashem, the war of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, those who are fighting to save the Jewish people are experiencing. But at the very least, we should be like Yocheved, to prepare the basket, to enable these soldiers to be successful, to use whatever opportunities we have, the political influence that we have, and to let everybody know that we will stand with our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, and we will hold them responsible for everything that happens to them. We have to be motivated by emes v'sheker. It is because it is, and there can't be any other way. That's our obligation. We cannot fall because hayamim you may be Korean Adam. We can't make the mistake of Adam Arishon. We can't. We have to bring life to our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael in their time of trouble. We should be at least like Yocheved, to fix the basket, to enable them that that they will be successful in being the saviors, in being as acting as the agents of God in saving the Jewish people. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Was there a Medrash Plia about
That's a Medrash Plia. It's a Medrash Plia.
Yeah.
They try to explain it in all kinds of other ways.
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat, so thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, I'll be in touch.